Daddy, are these really our seats?
Just this once, baby. You get to feel special. Sir, I'm gonna need you and your daughter to move. Someone more important needs those seats.
Daddy, I thought these were our special seats.
The best seats must be in the back, baby.
Sergeant Ford, it is an honor to have you aboard my aircraft.
How do you know my name?
Captain, I was only following procedure. That wasn't procedure. That was a disgrace.
This man and his daughter are not moving. These belong to...
Thanks for watching. Follow A Brighter Destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
They pulled my daughter and me out of our first-class seats in front of a full cabin, made us stand up, gather our bags, and walk the whole length of that aircraft past every staring face to 2 middle seats in the very last row beside the lavatory, because somebody more important than a limping man and his 7-year-old needed our spots. I didn't argue. I learned that lesson in a place a lot harder than an airport gate. You can lose your seat and keep your dignity in the same breath. I wasn't about to let my little girl watch her daddy make a scene over a chair. So I picked up our bags, I took Josie's hand, and we started the long walk toward the back of the plane. That's when the cockpit door opened, and the captain stepped out. He looked right at me. 300 passengers went quiet at once. He came to attention in that narrow aisle, and he raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute, and he held it there. And nobody on that airplane, not the gate agent who'd humiliated us, not the passengers who'd looked away, not one single soul understood yet why the captain of Heartland Skyflight 2247 was standing in the aisle saluting the limping man they'd just thrown out of first class. I'm going to tell you the whole thing, start to finish, because I think it's worth your time. But do one small thing for me first. If you believe the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the folks who never ask for anything deserve to be seen once in a while, tap that subscribe button and settle in. That's the whole fare. Now let me take you back to the gate. My name is Daniel Ford. Everybody calls me Danny. I'm 42 years old, and I'll tell you up front that I'm a veteran, because it matters to this story. I did 3 tours overseas, and I came home from the last one missing most of my right leg below the knee, with a back full of hardware and a couple of other souvenirs the doctors still keep an eye on twice a year. I walk with a cane on good days and worse than that on bad ones. I don't lead with any of it normally. I did my job. Better men than me didn't come home to do anything at all, and the least I can do is not make a production out of having survived. If you'd seen me at Gate C-14 in Omaha that morning, you'd have seen a tired-looking man in a gray flannel shirt, holding a cane in one hand and a little girl's hand in the other, and you'd have had no reason to think twice about either of us. That's exactly how I like it. There's a thing nobody tells you about coming home from a war with pieces missing. Some childish corner of you expects the world to somehow know, the way it would if you'd come home to a parade. But there are no parades for most of us. You heal as much as you're going to heal, and then you go to the grocery store, the gas station, the school pickup line, on a leg built out of carbon fiber and titanium, and not one soul has the first idea. The cashier gets impatient because you're slow on the stairs. The man behind you in line sighs because you're holding up the line. You learn fast that the world doesn't owe you gratitude, and mostly won't hand you any, and you make your peace with being invisible. Most days it doesn't sting anymore. I'm a single father. My daughter's name is Josie. She's 7, and she's the entire reason my heart keeps beating on the hard mornings. Her mother, my wife Renee, passed 2 years ago this spring. Cancer. We'd been together since we were 19. She waited through 3 deployments. She was the one who taught me how to live again when I came home in pieces. And then the one battle I couldn't fight for her took her anyway, over 11 months, while I sat there useless in a plastic chair. That's the cruelest joke life ever played on me, and I've had a few played on me. I trained my whole adult life to protect people. I went back into fire for strangers. And when the person I loved most in the world got sick, not 1 ounce of my training was worth a thing. I couldn't carry her out of that hospital room. I could only sit by the bed and hold her hand and lie a little at the end about how good she looked, because she still cared how she looked, even then, which is a braver thing than anything I ever did overseas. Renee was the one who put me back together after I came home broken. She'd find me at 3 in the morning sitting in the dark, not saying a word, and she'd just sit down next to me and rest her head on my shoulder until the worst of it passed. She saved me more times than I ever saved anybody. I couldn't save her once. A man doesn't get over that. He learns to carry it, and he learns to be a decent father anyway, because there's a little girl who needs her breakfast made and her hair braided badly, in my case, but made all the same. It's been Josie and me ever since. A wounded old soldier and a 7-year-old, figuring it out one Tuesday at a time. Now, I need to explain why we were on that plane, and why our seats were up front, because if you don't understand that part, the rest of this won't land the way it should. Renee grew up on the North Carolina coast. The ocean was her whole heart, she used to say. The sound of the waves was the only thing that ever fully quieted her mind. When we got married, dead broke, we drove 1,100 miles to Wrightsville Beach for our honeymoon and slept in the bed of my truck because we couldn't afford a room. We sat on that sand all night, and she told me that someday we'd bring our kids back there. We never got the chance, the two of us together. Before she passed, she asked me for one thing. She asked me to take Josie to that beach when she was old enough to remember it, and to bring a little of her along, so the ocean she'd loved her whole life could take her home one more time. That's what this trip was. I was carrying my daughter across 3 states to say goodbye to her mother at the edge of the sea. That's what was zipped so carefully into the carry-on bag between my feet, and here's why it was first class, which I know doesn't fit a man in a flannel shirt. 2 reasons. The first is practical 5 hours folded into a coach seat built for a smaller, younger, whole man is more than my back, and what's left of my leg can genuinely survive anymore. I'd have landed unable to walk, and I needed to be able to walk to carry my wife the last 100 yards to the water. The second reason matters more. I'd saved for 2 years. A coffee can on top of the refrigerator a few dollars at a time because I'd decided that this one trip, the trip where I took my baby to say goodbye to her mama, I was going to do right. My girl would fly up front once in her life, like the somebody special she is, because her mother would have wanted her treated like a princess on the saddest, most important journey of her small life. By the morning we flew, that can held $4,138 and change. Saved one Friday at a time, some weeks $20, some weeks $2. Josie called it the Ocean Fund, and some nights she'd drop in coins from her own little purse, dead serious about the whole operation, and I never once told her no, even though it broke something in me every time, because a child shouldn't have to save up allowance to say goodbye to her own mother. I picked up an extra shift wherever my leg would let me. I patched my boots with shoe glue instead of buying new ones. And the day I finally counted that can out on the kitchen table and saw I had enough to do this right, I sat down in that chair and cried like a boy, because I'd kept the promise. I was going to take my girls to the sea. That can is what the man in the expensive suit tried to take from us. He had no idea, but that's exactly what he was reaching for. So you'll understand why, when we boarded 2247 that morning and Josie saw those wide leather seats and her eyes went round as dinner plates, and she looked up at me and whispered, "Daddy, is this really ours?" That was the best moment I'd had in 2 years. I got her buckled in, got her blanket tucked around her, and I sat back and let my legs stretch out for the first time in longer than I could remember. For about 10 minutes I felt like I'd done something right. I felt like maybe Renee was watching and nodding. Then the trouble started. A gate supervisor came aboard, a sharp-dressed man in his 30s named Marcus Feld, a laminated badge on his belt and a tablet gripped tight in one hand. The kind of grip that means somebody upstairs is already texting him. He talked in low tones to the lead flight attendant near the front, and both of them kept glancing back toward our row. Then Marcus came down the aisle, crouched next to me, and said, in a voice that wasn't nearly as quiet as he thought it was, "Sir, I'm going to need to reseat you and your daughter today. We have a situation up here. I'm sorry, reseat us. These are our seats," I said, reaching for the tickets. "I've got the confirmation right here." He gave me a look. You've seen that look or one just like it sometime in your life. It's the look that prices your flannel shirt and your cane and your daughter's hand-me-down coat in about half a second and decides, right then, exactly how much you're worth arguing with. "I understand, sir," he said, "but we have a passenger who needs to be accommodated in this cabin, and per policy, we're moving you and the child to the rear. It's the fairest way to handle it. A passenger who needed the seat more than a wounded man and his motherless little girl on their way to bury her mother's ashes. That passenger turned out to be a regional sales executive named Gregory Voss, running late for the flight, carrying an account the airline badly did not want to upset, and not the least bit interested in which 2 people got thrown out of their seats to make room for him. Here's the part I keep coming back to. They didn't pick a businessman to bump. They didn't pick somebody with a lawyer on speed dial who might raise hell. They looked down that first-class cabin and chose the 2 people they figured would go quietly. They picked the man in the flannel shirt with the cane, and the child beside him, because we looked like we didn't belong up there in the first place, like we'd be grateful for whatever scraps they handed us, like nobody in a suit would ever have to answer for it. They picked us because they looked at me and saw somebody who didn't count. And the part that put a knot in my throat I can still feel today was Josie. She looked up at me, her small face starting to crumple, and she said, "Daddy, do we have to go? I thought these were our special seats." What do you say to that? What do you tell your 7-year-old on the trip you saved 2 years for, on the way to say goodbye to her mother, when a man with a tablet has just decided she isn't worth a seat up front? I'll tell you exactly what I said. I leaned down, and I smiled at her the best I had in me, and I said, "You know what, baby? Turns out the very best seats are all the way in the back, where you can see the whole plane." let's go find them. Because the one thing that man was not going to take from my daughter was the joy of that morning. He could have the seat. He was not getting her smile. So I stood up on a leg that doesn't always want to cooperate, gathered our bags, and got ready to walk us both the length of that aircraft with my head up, because I've walked through worse than 300 staring strangers, and I wasn't about to give any of them the satisfaction of watching me bend. But I'll be honest about what was happening underneath, because the calm on the outside was a performance for Josie's sake. Underneath I was coming apart. Not over the seat I've slept in mud, I've slept in worse than mud, a seat is a seat. It was that they'd done it in front of her. It was that I'd spent 2 years and every spare dollar giving my daughter one day of feeling special on the hardest journey of her short life. And a stranger with a tablet had erased it in 30 seconds and made her watch her father get treated like he didn't count. I could take the bump. I could not take the lesson it was teaching her that some people matter and some people don't, and her father was the second kind. What I didn't know, standing there half out of my seat with bags in one hand and Josie's fingers in the other, was that 2 people on that aircraft had watched the entire thing and were not going to let it stand. The first was Carol Jennings, the lead flight attendant, a woman somewhere near 50 who'd worked that front cabin long enough to have seen it before and hated it every time. She'd noticed something Marcus Feld had been too busy and too important to notice. She'd clocked my cane the particular way a man stands when half his leg is metal and carbon fiber. She'd seen the small brass challenge coin clipped to the strap of my carry-on, the one from my old unit I never travel without. And she'd caught a glimpse, when I pulled out our tickets, of the laminated veteran's ID tucked in behind them. Carol didn't think that was right, so while I was still gathering our bags, she walked to the cockpit, knocked, and told the captain exactly what was unfolding in his first-class cabin. And Captain Walter Hayes, the second person who wasn't going to let it stand, was a veteran himself. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was that I was 3 steps into that long walk toward the back when the cockpit door opened, and the whole front of the plane seemed to hold its breath at once. Because a captain stepping out of the cockpit mid-boarding is not a small thing. He was an older man, gray at the temples, carrying that particular steadiness some men only earn the hard way. He didn't look at Marcus Feld. He didn't look at Gregory Voss standing there in his suit. He looked straight at me, the tired, limping man, being marched to the back of his own airplane, and something moved across his face that I can only call recognition. Not of me personally, of what I was, of that coin, that cane, that laminated card. Then Captain Walter Hayes, in front of 300 passengers, came to attention in the aisle of a commercial aircraft, raised his hand in a slow textbook salute, and held it on me. And did not lower it, and the cabin went absolutely silent. I want to tell you what that did to me, because I wasn't ready for it. For 2 years I'd been invisible, the wounded guy, the widower, the flannel shirt nobody looks at twice. I'd gotten so used to not mattering that some part of me had started to believe it. And here was a stranger in a captain's uniform, holding a salute on me like I was somebody, in front of the very people who'd just decided I was nothing. My eyes stung. I had to swallow hard, and I did the only thing a soldier can do when an officer renders honors. I let go of my bag, straightened up as much as my body allows anymore, and returned it. 2 veterans, one in a captain's uniform, one in a flannel shirt, standing in the aisle of a commercial airplane, honoring something most of the people around us couldn't even see. You have to understand what a salute means between soldiers, because it isn't just a gesture, it's a whole language folded into one motion. It says, I see what you are, I see what you carried, I carried some of it too. You are not invisible to me. When Captain Hayes held that salute on me, he said all of that without a single word, in front of every person who'd just decided I didn't matter. What undid me wasn't pride, the pride got burned out of me a long time ago overseas. It was relief. The bone-deep relief of being seen, after 2 years of being looked straight through, on the one day I needed it most, in front of the one person who most needed to see it happen. There are moments in a life that crack you open. Standing in that aisle, returning an old captain's salute while my daughter watched, was one of mine. Then Captain Hayes lowered his hand and walked the length of the aisle toward me. He stuck out his hand, shook mine, and said loud enough for that whole silent cabin to hear, "Sir, it is an honor to have you aboard my aircraft." And then slowly he turned to look at Marcus Feld, and at Gregory Voss, still standing there in his tailored suit waiting to claim my seat. The temperature in that cabin dropped about 30 degrees. Still calm, still quiet, but in a voice that carried clean to the back row, the captain said, "This man and his daughter are not moving. They are exactly where they belong, and I believe someone owes them an apology." I didn't know the rest of it yet. I figured this was simply one veteran honoring another, and that alone had already undone me. But there was more a reason this particular captain had come out of that cockpit on this particular morning, and I'll get to it. But first, let me tell you what happened to Marcus Feld and Gregory Voss, because I think you'll enjoy it about as much as I did. Marcus went pale. He started stammering something about protocol, about the seating situation, about following procedure. Captain Hayes let him talk himself all the way out, and then said simply, "Your procedure just tried to remove a decorated combat veteran and his motherless child from seats they paid for, to make room for a man who showed up late. That isn't procedure, that's a disgrace, fix it now." Gregory Voss, and I'll give him this much, had clearly heard enough of himself reflected back through another man's voice, because he went red in the face and said, it's fine, I'll take another seat," and all but fled toward the rear of the plane himself, which I thought was the most decent thing he managed to do that entire morning. Just like that, Josie and I were back in our seats, our special seats. Carol Jennings knelt down beside my daughter and made an enormous fuss over her, brought her a little pair of wings, brought her extra cookies, treated her like the princess her mother had always wanted her to feel like. And Josie, who 5 minutes earlier had watched her father humiliated in front of strangers, was glowing like a lit-up window, telling Carol all about the ocean we were going to see. The whole cabin had shifted around us. That's the part I keep turning over. The same people who'd watched us get marched toward the back, who'd looked away the way people do when somebody's being humiliated and they don't want any part of it, those same people were sitting up now, smiling at my daughter, more than a couple of them with wet eyes. An older gentleman across the aisle reached over and shook my hand without a word, and just nodded the way old soldiers do. Nobody apologized out loud, most of them, but you could feel 300 people quietly rewriting the story they told themselves about the limping man in the flannel shirt. That's its own kind of apology, the kind that doesn't need saying. I sat there with my throat tight and I thought, Renee, I almost let them take it from her. And somebody I'd never met just handed it back, but I still didn't understand why. Not fully, not until we were an hour into the flight. When Captain Hayes did something pilots don't usually do, he had Carol come back and ask if I'd be willing to step up front for a minute while the first officer flew. I made my way up the aisle on my cane, and the captain half turned in his seat, and the composed captain's mask was gone. There were tears standing in this grown man's eyes. "Surgeon Ford," he said my old rank, which meant he'd already looked me up. "I need to tell you something, and I've been trying to find the words since I saw your name on my manifest." "Sir?" 3 years ago, the convoy, the ambush outside the wire, the vehicle that took a direct hit, and the man who went back into the fire 3 separate times to pull wounded soldiers out while it was still burning. That was you. My blood went cold because yes, that was me. That was the worst day of my life, the one the medal in my dresser drawer is for. The medal I've never once taken out to look at, because the men I remember from that day aren't all here to look at it with me. People think a medal for valor is a happy thing, a trophy. I understand why they think that, but it isn't, not for most of the men I know who carry one. A medal like that is a receipt. It's a record of the worst day of your life, the day that earned it, and every man I know with one would hand it back in a heartbeat to undo the day it came from. I didn't go back into that fire to be brave. I want to be honest about that because the word hero embarrasses me. I went back in because those were my men, and there wasn't a single cell in my body capable of standing down while they burned. It wasn't courage. It was that I'd rather have died than lived with not going. I got 2 of them out. I didn't get all of them. That arithmetic, who I got, who I didn't, is heavier than the leg. Heavier than anything. My son was in that vehicle, Captain Hayes said, his voice breaking clean in half. My son was one of the men you pulled out of the fire. My boy came home to me because you went back in when any sane man would have stayed down. You gave your leg getting him out of that truck. I've spent 3 years not knowing your name, just knowing there was a sergeant who saved my boy. And this morning I'm flying a routine route, and my flight attendant tells me they're throwing a wounded veteran named Ford out of first class. And I checked the manifest, and he couldn't finish. He put his hand over his mouth and his shoulders shook. I stood there in the cockpit doorway, leaning on my cane, and I couldn't say a word either, because the whole world had just gone strange and enormous. Of all the flights in this country, on the one trip I'd saved 2 years for, to carry my wife home to the sea, I had boarded the single aircraft in the sky being flown by the father of a man I had pulled out of a burning truck 3 years earlier. You can call that coincidence if you want. I've stopped calling it that. I've turned it over 1,000 times on long nights, trying to make the odds work in my head, and they don't work. There are tens of thousands of pilots flying this country every single day. For me to save, by sheer chance, the exact 2 seats 2 years in advance, with money out of a coffee can, on the one airline, the one route, the one morning, flown by the one man in the entire sky who happened carried out of a burning vehicle, there's no math for that. I gave up on the math. I believe Renee had a hand in it if you want to know what I really think. I believe she looked down at her grieving husband and her motherless girl, saving up nickels to bring her home to the sea, and she pulled some strings that aren't ours to pull, and made sure that on that flight, of all flights, somebody up front would stand and show our daughter her father mattered. You can believe that or not. I know what I believe. Captain Hayes gathered himself and gripped my hand in both of his. My son is alive and well, he said. He's got 2 children of his own now. 2 children who exist because of what you did. I am going to fly you and your daughter to that coast more carefully than I have flown anything in my career. It is the greatest honor of my life to have you on my aircraft, Sergeant. You should never have been asked to stand up. Not on my plane, not ever. I made my way back down the aisle, past all those faces that had watched me get thrown out and then watched me get honored, and they were different faces now. I sat back down next to my daughter, who'd drifted off with her head against the window, her small hand still in mine, and I looked out at the clouds and had a long, quiet conversation with my wife that I'm not going to share, because some things belong only to a man and the woman he's flying home to the sea. Now the part you might be waiting for. Yes, the airline made it right. Once word climbed the chain, corporate moved fast, because a story about throwing a decorated veteran and his motherless daughter out of first class is not a story any airline wants circulating. They refunded the entire trip. They offered lifetime travel privileges first class, anywhere, which I'll rarely ever use for a reason I'll get to. In the days that followed, 3 other people came forward on their own. 2 men Captain Hayes had flown before, and a young widow who'd once sat beside me on a red eye and remembered exactly how quietly I'd helped her lift a stroller into the overhead bin, without a word of self-congratulation, each of them writing in to say the same plain thing, that the man in the flannel shirt had never once, in their experience of him, needed anyone to know what he'd survived. Heartland Sky opened a review into gate procedures. I asked pointedly that Marcus Feld not be fired over it. People were surprised, but I've made my own share of mistakes, and I've seen what losing everything over one bad morning does to a young man. I didn't want my wife's last journey to be the reason some kid lost his job. I wanted him to learn something, not be destroyed by it. 6 weeks later, he wrote me a letter that made me think maybe he had. None of that, not the refund, not the travel benefits, not the letter as the reward. I want to be clear about that, because if you've spent any time with stories like this one, you already know how I feel. You don't do the right thing for a reward, and you certainly don't get honored for one. The day I went back into that fire, I wasn't thinking about medals. I was thinking about the men in that truck. The reward was my daughter's face, because here's what I haven't told you yet. Josie saw all of it. She wasn't asleep for the part that mattered. My little girl, who'd just watched her father get told he wasn't important enough for his own seat, who'd watched me start the long walk to the back like I was nothing, she got to watch the captain of the whole aircraft stand and salute her father. She got to watch 300 strangers who'd looked away from us suddenly sit up and look at her daddy like he was somebody. She got to hear later, when I judged her old enough for a piece of it, that her father had done something brave a long time ago, something that saved lives, something a grown man in a captain's uniform had cried about. For 2 years my daughter has watched me struggle, watched me lose her mother, watched the world look straight past both of us. On that one impossible morning, she got to see her father honored. That's the reward. I wouldn't trade it for anything else they could have offered. We made it to the coast. Captain Hayes flew smooth as glass, true to his word, and when we landed he walked us off the plane himself, hugged Josie and shook my hand one last time, holding it a long moment. 2 fathers who never would have met, if not for the worst day of my life. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, "for my boy." I told him, "Thank you, Captain." For my girl. We drove to Wrightsville Beach, the same stretch of sand where we'd slept in the truck bed a lifetime earlier. On a gray, quiet morning, with the waves coming in soft, I held my daughter's hand and carried my wife down to the edge of the water, and the 3 of us went to the ocean together one last time. I won't tell you what Josie said or what I said because it belongs to her and to me and to her mother. I'll only tell you the sea took Renee home gentle, the way she'd have wanted, and that my daughter stood in the surf laughing through her tears, and that somewhere in all of it I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years, which was peace, the kind that only comes from keeping a promise that cost you everything to keep. Josie asked me, standing there in the cold surf with her jeans rolled up, whether her mama could see us. I told her the truth as best I understand it. Yes, baby, I believe she can. And I believe she's been watching this whole time, and I believe she's real proud of how brave you've been. Josie looked out at that gray water a long moment, the exact way her mother used to, and it stopped my heart a little. Then she said, "Bye, Mama, I brought you home." 4 words from a 7-year-old, and they nearly put me down in the sand. Because that's what we'd done, the 2 of us. All those nickels in a can, all that pushing through. We brought her home. Those lifetime first-class benefits I mentioned, I keep them for one reason. Once a year on the anniversary, I take Josie back to that beach first class, the way her mother wanted. And every single time before we go, I check who's flying, because Captain Hayes is still up there, still flying. A couple of times now, it's been his aircraft. A couple of times his grandchildren, the children of the boy I pulled out of that fire, have been waiting at the gate to meet us. Two families stitched together forever by the worst day of one of our lives, headed to the ocean. That's the only reason I keep the seats, not for the leather, for the people they let me reach. Last spring it was his plane again, and his son came along too, the man himself, grown now, gone a little gray at the edges just like his father. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. He just hugged me at the gate for a long, long time, this big grown soldier, and over his shoulder I watched our kids, his two, and my Josie chase each other around the seating area like they'd known one another their whole lives. In a way they had, because every one of them exists because of the same terrible holy morning. For 3 years all I could see was the column of men I didn't save. And here at an airport gate stood the children of one I did, running and laughing alive, because a man in a flannel shirt once had a worse day than he thought he could carry, and carried it anyway. I'm still just a limping man in a flannel shirt. I'll never be rich. I'll never be important in the way this world usually means that word. Most days, the world still looks right past me, and that's all right. I learned something on that airplane I already half knew, and needed reminding of anyway, that the world is full of people getting looked past, priced in half a second by a shirt and a cane, by folks who have no idea what that person has carried, or given, or lost. The gate agent looked at me and saw nobody. The captain looked at me and saw everything. The only difference between those two men was that one of them bothered to find out. There's a whole world of difference between the people who price your shirt and the people who ask your story, and I've decided, for whatever years I've got left, to try and be the second kind. That night after the beach, Josie was drifting off in the hotel bed, quiet for a long while, and then she said, "Was the captain right? Are you a hero?" I thought about how to answer that the way you do, and I finally said, "No, baby. I'm just your dad. But a long time ago I had a real bad day, and I tried to do the right thing on it, and some good men came home because of it. That's all a hero is, I think. Just a regular person who tried to do the right thing on their worst day." She thought about that a while, and nodded, and then she said, "I'm going to do the right thing on my worst day too." And she fell asleep. I sat there in the dark next to my sleeping girl, and I thought, well, Renee, there it is. That's the whole thing we were ever trying to give her. She's got it. She's going to be all right. So let me leave you with the one thing I keep coming back to, because I'd love to hear what you make of it. That gate agent and that captain looked at the exact same man in the exact same flannel shirt, and one of them saw nobody worth a second glance, and the other saw somebody worth saluting. The only thing that separated them was whether they bothered to learn the story. So tell me, down in the comments, when has somebody bothered to learn your story? Or the story of someone you'd already written off, and it changed everything? Who saw the real you when the rest of the world looked right past? I read every comment that comes in. Stories like that one are the whole reason I keep telling mine. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual company or institution.